The street was already loud before the challenge ever happened. It was one of those open, public spaces where crowds naturally gathered, people walking past, phones in hand, half paying attention to whatever noise rose above the rest. In the center of it all stood Steven Seagal, calm and unassuming, dressed simply, not drawing attention to himself. To most people watching, he looked like just another older man standing quietly at the edge of the action. But not everyone saw him that way. A street fighter had been working the crowd for several minutes already. He was younger built, moving with the restless energy of someone who fed off attention. Every sentence he spoke was louder than the last. Every gesture was exaggerated. He wasn't there to train or demonstrate technique. He was there to dominate the moment, and then his eyes locked onto Steven. At first it looked like curiosity, then amusement, then something sharper, confidence mixed with contempt. The fighter took a step forward, scanning Steven from head to toe, clearly measuring him up in his mind. What he saw made him smirk. This guy. He laughed, loud enough for everyone around to hear. This is who people talk about. A few people chuckled. Others turned their phones slightly, sensing something was about to happen. The street fighter raised his voice. I don't care who you think you are, he said, pacing slowly. Age, fame, reputation, none of that works out here. Steven didn't respond. He didn't shift his stance. He didn't even look offended. He simply stood there, relaxed, hands loose, eyes steady. That calm only made the fighter bolder. You give me 10 seconds. The fighter continued, pointing directly at him, and I'll put you on the ground. No cameras, no excuses. Now the crowd was fully engaged. People leaned in. Phones came up higher. Whispers spread from one side to the other. Some were excited, some were nervous. A few already sensed this was a bad idea, but no one stepped in. Steven finally turned his head slightly, meeting the fighter's eyes for the first time. There was no anger there, no challenge, just awareness. That moment should have been a warning. Instead, the fighter took it as confirmation. He stepped closer, invading Steven's space, chest out, shoulders squared. See, he said to the crowd. He doesn't even want to look at me. A hush fell over the people nearest to them. Even the fighter's voice dropped slightly, as if something in the air had shifted and he didn't quite understand why. Steven spoke at last, quietly, almost casually. You don't need 10 seconds, he said. The fighter blinked. What? You don't even need 5. The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. But they landed harder than shouting ever could. The street fighter laughed again, too fast, too forced. He rolled his shoulders, shook out his arms, and took a half step back into what he thought was a fighting stance. All right, he said. Your move. What the crowd didn't realize yet, what the fighter couldn't see, was that the moment he issued that challenge, everything had already changed. And the first move hadn't even happened yet. The moment the challenge was spoken out loud, the energy around them shifted. People who had been casually passing by now stopped completely. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the background noise of the street seemed to dull, as if everyone instinctively sensed that what was about to happen wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a test. The street fighter bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, loosening his shoulders, shaking his arms with exaggerated confidence. He wanted the crowd to see how ready he was, how fearless, how sure. Every movement was designed to project dominance. Steven Seagal, on the other hand, did almost nothing. He didn't square up in a traditional stance. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't even adjust his footing in any obvious way. To an untrained eye, it looked like he wasn't preparing at all, and that illusion only fueled the fighter's confidence. Look at him, the fighter said loudly, glancing back at the crowd. He doesn't even know how to stand. A few nervous laughs rippled through the people watching. Phones were now fully raised. Someone whispered, "This is about to go bad," though no one could say for whom. The fighter stepped in closer again, just outside arm's reach, testing distance. He feinted with his shoulders, trying to provoke a reaction. Still nothing. Steven's face remained neutral, his breathing slow, his posture loose, almost casual. That calm was beginning to irritate the fighter. "You scared?" he asked, leaning forward. "Because you should be." Steven didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his weight barely. It was so subtle that most of the crowd missed it completely. But the fighter didn't. Something in his instincts registered the change, even if his ego refused to listen. He hesitated for half a second. Then pride took over. The fighter lunged forward, throwing a fast, aggressive punch aimed squarely at Steven's head. It wasn't sloppy. It wasn't careless. It was the kind of strike thrown by someone who had spent years fighting without rules, relying on speed and intimidation to overwhelm opponents. But the punch never landed. Steven didn't block it in the way most people expected. There was no dramatic clash of arms, no loud impact. Instead, he turned just slightly, letting the punch slide past where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier. At the same time, his hand came up, not hard, not fast enough to look violent, just precise. The fighter felt it before he understood it. His arm suddenly felt heavier, off balance, like it no longer belonged to him. The crowd gasped as the fighter stumbled a step forward, forced to plant his foot awkwardly to keep from falling. Confusion flashed across his face. That wasn't supposed to happen. He had thrown clean. He had committed fully. How? He started, shaking out his arm. Steven was already moving again, not advancing, not attacking, adjusting. The fighter tried to recover his rhythm, circling now, anger creeping into his expression. The crowd could feel it too, the shift from confidence to frustration. This was no longer about proving something. It was about regaining control. He threw another strike, faster this time, followed by a second, trying to overwhelm Steven with sheer volume. That's when people closest to them noticed something unsettling. Steven wasn't reacting late, he was reacting early. Every movement seemed to anticipate what came next. His feet slid across the ground with quiet efficiency. His hands intercepted just enough to redirect, never meeting force with force, never wasting energy. The fighter's breathing grew louder, his movements less precise. And then, in his rush to assert dominance, he made a mistake. He stepped too close. The crowd saw Steven's posture change at last, not dramatically, not aggressively, but decisively. The relaxed calm condensed into something sharper, more focused. The second move was coming, and this time no one in the crowd was laughing anymore. The distance between them vanished in an instant. The street fighter stepped in, trying to crowd Steven, to smother whatever advantage he thought had just slipped through his fingers. His instincts told him pressure would fix it. Speed would fix it. Aggression always had before. What he didn't understand was that this was exactly what Steven had been waiting for. The second move didn't look like a strike at all. As the fighter closed the gap, Steven angled his body slightly, placing himself just off the center line. To the crowd, it seemed like a simple sidestep, almost accidental. But to the fighter, it felt like the ground itself had shifted beneath him. Steven's hand made contact with the fighter's arm, not hard, not violently. It was more like a guiding touch, redirecting momentum rather than stopping it. In the same fluid motion, Steven stepped behind the fighter's shoulder. Suddenly, the fighter wasn't facing his opponent anymore. He was twisted halfway around, his balance compromised, his weight stacked awkwardly on one leg. For the first time since the confrontation began, panic flickered across his face. The crowd reacted instantly. A sharp intake of breath, a few startled shouts. Phones shook as people tried to keep the moment in frame. The fighter tried to pull free, muscles tensing, strength surging in a desperate attempt to overpower whatever hold he believed he was in. But the harder he pushed, the worse it became. Every ounce of resistance seemed to work against him. Steven remained calm, almost expressionless. "This isn't strength," he said quietly, close enough for the fighter to hear. "It's timing." With a minimal shift of his hips and a subtle turn of his wrist, Steven completed the second move. The effect was immediate. The fighter's knees buckled as if someone had suddenly cut his power. His upper body dipped forward, his arms flailing instinctively as he tried to regain balance that was no longer there. Steven let go. That was the most terrifying part. There was no shove, no throw, no dramatic finish. The fighter simply collapsed forward, catching himself with one hand on the ground, breathing hard, eyes wide with disbelief. He looked less like a challenger now, and more like someone waking up from a bad dream. For a split second, it seemed like it was over. But ego doesn't surrender easily. Fueled by embarrassment and adrenaline, the fighter surged back to his feet, anger burning hot enough to drown out reason. His face was red now, jaw clenched, pride wounded in front of dozens of strangers and countless cameras. "You think that's it?" he snapped, swinging wildly as he stepped in again. This time, there was no technique, only rage. And that's when the third move happened. It was so fast, so clean, that many people didn't even realize what they'd seen until it was already over. Steven stepped forward into the attack, closing the distance instead of retreating. His arm rose not to strike, but to intercept. In one smooth motion, he disrupted the fighter's center of gravity, applying pressure at exactly the wrong angle for resistance. The fighter's feet left the ground, Not violently, not spectacularly, just enough. He hit the pavement with a heavy thud that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The sound alone made the crowd fall silent. Phones froze mid-record. Someone near the front covered their mouth in shock. The fighter lay there stunned, staring up at the sky as if trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He made no move to get up. Steven stood over him for a moment, not looming, not threatening, just present. Then he took a step back, no victory pose, no taunting words, no acknowledgement of the crowd at all. That restraint spoke louder than anything else could have. The silence stretched. A few seconds passed before anyone dared to speak. When the noise finally returned, it wasn't cheering. It wasn't laughter. It was low, stunned murmurs, people trying to process what they had just witnessed. That was nothing, someone whispered. Another voice replied, that was everything. The street fighter slowly rolled onto his side, pride visibly shattered. He avoided Steven's eyes, avoided the cameras, avoided the crowd. The bravado he had arrived with was gone, replaced by the quiet realization that he had challenged something he didn't understand. Steven turned to leave. As he walked away, the crowd parted without thinking, creating a clear path for him. No one tried to stop him. No one shouted questions. No one asked for explanations. They didn't need them. In less than a minute, with just 3 movements and no wasted effort, the chaos had been settled. And the most unsettling truth lingered in the air, long after Steven disappeared from view. He never even looked like he was trying. The aftermath didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with stillness. Steven Seagal was already several steps away when the world seemed to remember how to breathe again. The street fighter remained on the ground for a moment longer, blinking, one hand pressed against the pavement, as if checking whether it was real. His confidence, so loud just minutes earlier, had evaporated, leaving behind something far heavier. Awareness. People lowered their phones slowly, almost reluctantly. Like they'd just witnessed something they weren't sure they were supposed to see. A few replayed clips instantly, eyes darting between their screens and the fighter still on the ground, trying to match what they felt with what they'd recorded. Someone finally spoke. Is he okay? The question wasn't dramatic, it was human. The fighter pushed himself up onto one knee, then stood wobbling slightly before finding his balance. There was no anger now, no shouting, no attempt to reclaim the spotlight. He avoided eye contact with everyone, especially the cameras. His shoulders slumped as he brushed dust from his clothes, though it was clear he didn't care how he looked anymore. What had been damaged wasn't his body, it was his certainty. Steven paused a few steps away, turning just enough to see the fighter standing again. Their eyes met briefly. In that glance there was no triumph, no warning, only a quiet acknowledgement that the lesson had already been delivered. You good? Steven asked calmly. The fighter nodded. Once, yes. That single word carried more weight than all the bravado that had come before it. Steven nodded back and continued walking. No one tried to follow him. No one tried to stop him. The crowd parted naturally, instinctively, as if making space wasn't a choice but a reflex. It wasn't respect born from fear, it was something deeper. Recognition. Behind him the fighter stood frozen for a few seconds longer before turning and walking in the opposite direction. No explanations. No excuses. Just a man leaving a moment he'd never forget. The crowd slowly dispersed, conversations breaking out in hushed tones. Did you see how fast that was? He didn't even hit him. That wasn't fighting, that was control. People weren't replaying violence in their minds. They were replaying restraint. A woman near the edge of the group shook her head and said quietly, he never raised his voice once. That observation lingered. Because that was the detail everyone kept coming back to, not the takedown, not the fall, not the shock. It was the calm. The way Steven never seemed rushed, never seemed angry, never seemed threatened. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One man had entered the space demanding attention, challenging authority, feeding off the energy of the crowd. The other had stood silently, absorbing the moment without needing to control it, until control became necessary. And when it did, it ended everything. A few minutes later, the street looked normal again. People resumed walking. Traffic noise returned. The moment slipped into memory, preserved only on phones and in stunned conversations. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, something had shifted. They had seen what happens when ego collides with experience. They had seen how real power doesn't announce itself. And they had seen how chaos doesn't always end with force. Sometimes it ends with precision. Because moments like that don't just entertain, They expose something uncomfortable. They remind people how often confidence is mistaken for competence, and how easily noise can disguise weakness. Steven Seagal never explained himself. He didn't have to. The fighter never challenged anyone again that day. That much was clear. And somewhere between those two truths lived the real lesson of the encounter. You don't need to prove who you are, when what you are speaks for itself. If you were in that crowd, would you have walked away, or stayed to see how it ended? By the time the crowd fully dispersed, the story had already begun to spread. Clips were being uploaded. Group chats were buzzing. Strangers who had never met before were exchanging opinions as if they had just witnessed something historic. But what fascinated people wasn't just the speed of the outcome, it was the simplicity of it. There had been no dramatic build-up from Steven, no threats, no flexing, no speeches, and yet, in less than a minute, the loudest person in the area had been reduced to silence. The street fighter walked several blocks before slowing down. His breathing had steadied, but his mind hadn't. He replayed the 3 moves over and over again, trying to locate the exact moment he had lost control. Was it the first punch? The angle shift? The grip he couldn't break? The truth was harder to accept. He had lost control the moment he let ego make the first decision. Meanwhile, Steven didn't look back. He moved through the street the same way he had before the confrontation, calm, unhurried, almost invisible. If someone had passed him without knowing what had happened, they would never have guessed that chaos had just unfolded minutes earlier. That was the part people couldn't understand. Why didn't he celebrate? Why didn't he address the crowd? Why didn't he at least acknowledge what he had just done? Because for him, there was nothing to prove. A young man who had recorded the entire incident caught up to Steven a short distance away. He hesitated before speaking. "Sir," he said cautiously, "that was insane. How did you do that without even trying?" Steven stopped walking but didn't turn fully around. "I was trying," he replied calmly. "Just not the way he was." The young man frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Steven paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "He was trying to win," he said. "I was trying to end it." That difference hung in the air. Winning is loud, ending something is quiet. Back where the fight had happened, small groups were still analyzing what they'd seen. Some debated whether the fighter had underestimated Steven. Others argued that it was pure experience. A few insisted it had to be luck. But deep down, everyone knew it wasn't luck. Luck doesn't move with that level of timing. Luck doesn't breathe that steadily under pressure. The street fighter eventually stopped near a bench and sat down. For the first time since the confrontation, he allowed himself to fully feel it. Not the embarrassment, not the fall, but the clarity. He hadn't been outmatched by strength. He had been outmatched by patience. He thought about the moment Steven had said, "You don't need 10 seconds." At the time, it had sounded like arrogance. Now it felt like warning, and warnings aren't meant to humiliate. They're meant to prevent. The fighter exhaled slowly, staring at his hands. He had always relied on intimidation, speed, pressure. That strategy had worked for years. But against someone who refused to react emotionally, it collapsed instantly. For the first time in a long time, he questioned his own approach. Back on the street, life moved forward, cars passed, store doors opened and closed. Conversations shifted to other topics. But something invisible remained, a quiet respect for what had just taken place. People don't often witness real control. They witness noise. They witness anger. They witness aggression. But control, that's rare, and that's why the moment stuck. Later that evening, the clip would circulate online. Some viewers would cheer. Others would criticize. Many would argue about technique. But those who had stood there in person understood something the internet couldn't fully capture. The power wasn't in the takedown. It was in the restraint before it. Steven hadn't escalated the situation. He hadn't provoked. He hadn't humiliated. He simply responded when the line was crossed. And that response had been enough. The street fighter would remember that day for the rest of his life, not because he lost, but because he finally understood the difference between being loud and being ready. 3 moves. That was all it took. Not to destroy someone, but to reveal who truly had control all along. As night settled in and the streetlights flickered on, the moment refused to fade. People who had been there kept replaying it in their minds. Not the fall, not the shock, but the feeling. The strange quiet that followed. The way everything seemed to reset itself, as if the street had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Steven Seagal had already disappeared into the city, but his presence lingered. not as a legend or a celebrity, but as an example. Across town, the street fighter sat alone, scrolling through his phone. The video was everywhere now. Different angles, slow motion edits, comments stacking faster than he could read them. Some mocked him, some defended him, some praised Steven. He stopped reading. None of it mattered. What mattered was the realization that had settled in his chest, heavy and undeniable. He hadn't been beaten by a trick. He hadn't been embarrassed by luck. He had been exposed by contrast. Noise versus stillness, ego versus awareness. He remembered how Steven's breathing never changed, how his eyes never darted, how there was no panic, only presence. The fighter had always believed power was something you showed, something you imposed. But that day had rewritten the definition. Meanwhile, the people who witnessed it firsthand carried the moment differently. Some felt inspired, others unsettled, a few even uncomfortable, because what they saw forced them to confront their own instincts. How often do people escalate when they could de-escalate? How often does pride push situations further than they need to go? The encounter wasn't just about a fight anymore. It had turned into a mirror. A man who had been recording from the edge of the crowd later told his friend, "I kept waiting for Steven to lose his temper. It never happened. That's what scared me the most." And that fear wasn't about violence. It was about realizing how little control most people actually have when emotions take over. Steven hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't postured. He had simply stood his ground quietly. That was the difference. The street fighter, on the other hand, had entered the space already at full volume. Every move screamed urgency. Every word demanded attention. By the time the third move happened, his body was reacting faster than his mind could process. And that gap between reaction and awareness was where everything fell apart. Later that night, a group of friends who had been in the crowd sat around a table, replaying the clip again. "Did you notice?" One of them said. Steven didn't even finish the third move. Another nodded.
"Yeah."
He stopped as soon as it was over. That detail stood out more than anything else. He didn't need to prove dominance. He didn't need to send a message. The message had already been delivered. Control isn't about how hard you hit. It's about knowing when you don't need to. That lesson extended beyond fighting. It seeped into everyday life, in arguments and disagreements, in moments when tempers flare and words are thrown like weapons. Most people don't lose because they're weak. They lose because they react without thinking. The street fighter learned that lesson the hard way. In the days that followed, he didn't post explanations. He didn't challenge anyone else. He didn't try to reclaim attention. He went quiet. And in that silence, growth became possible. Steven, meanwhile, never commented publicly on the incident. No interviews. No statements. No attempts to shape the narrative. Because people who truly understand power don't chase narratives. They let moments speak. What happened that day wasn't a spectacle meant to impress. It was a demonstration meant to end something before it became worse, and that's why it stayed with people. Because chaos usually demands more chaos to stop it. But that day, chaos ended with calm. And that may have been the most powerful move of all. Be honest, do you think most confrontations escalate because of ego or fear? Time has a way of stripping moments down to their truth. Days after the incident, when the noise of the internet had moved on to the next spectacle, the memory of that street confrontation still lingered, especially for those who had been there in person. Without the comments, without the edits, without the slow motion, the truth of what happened became even clearer. Nothing about it was flashy. That was the point. Steven Seagal hadn't walked into the street to make a statement. He hadn't arrived looking for validation. The moment found him, and when it did, he met it with the same calm he had carried before it began. That calm was what ended everything. The street fighter eventually spoke to a friend about it, quietly, without defensiveness. He didn't frame it as a loss. He framed it as a lesson. "I thought strength was pressure," he admitted. "Turns out it's patience." Those words carried more growth than any excuse ever could. He had spent years believing that speed and aggression could solve any confrontation, that the loudest presence controlled the space. But one encounter had dismantled that belief completely. Not with force, with timing. Steven's 3 moves weren't about domination. They were about resolution. Each one removed an option, narrowed a path, and ended the conflict without prolonging it. That's what real mastery looks like. People who truly understand something don't rush to display it. They don't seek confrontation. They don't need to announce themselves. Their confidence exists whether anyone is watching or not. That truth applied far beyond martial arts. In arguments, in leadership, in life. How many conflicts spiral because no one wants to be the first to stay calm? How many situations turn ugly because pride refuses to step aside? What happened that day was a reminder that strength isn't proven by escalation, it's proven by restraint. Steven Seagal walked away without applause, without recognition, without explanation, and yet his presence reshaped the entire moment. The street returned to normal. The crowd moved on. The city swallowed the incident like it swallows everything else. But the lesson remained. For the fighter, it changed how he approached conflict. For the witnesses, it changed how they understood power. For everyone who later saw the clip, it offered a rare glimpse of what control actually looks like. 3 moves. No anger, no spectacle, no chaos left behind. Just clarity. That clarity is uncomfortable because it challenges a common belief that dominance must be loud, that respect must be demanded, that strength must be displayed. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who never needs to raise their voice. And when you see that kind of control up close, it's impossible to forget. Because real power doesn't seek attention. It ends the moment and walks away.